The air in the observatory was thin, biting. Not the good kind of biting, like the sharp, crisp air on a mountaintop, but the stale, recycled kind that clung to the back of my throat. Dust motes danced in the weak shafts of light that pierced the perpetual twilight of the dome. It had been years since I'd felt anything but a dull ache in my chest when I looked at the stars. Years since the wonder had been anything more than a ghost, a faint memory of a younger me, eyes wide with possibility. Now it was just a job. Data streams, spectral analysis, the endless, soul-crushing monotony of cataloging the predictable ballet of celestial bodies. My colleagues, what few remained after the funding cuts, moved like automatons, their faces etched with the same weary resignation I felt settling into my own bones. We were caretakers of a dying dream, tending to a museum of the cosmos that no one seemed to visit anymore. I'd taken this post at the Glacier research camp. Ancient ice core reveals impossible age for the quiet. The isolation. A desperate attempt to outrun the noise in my head, the echoes of pronouncements I'd made, the theories that had crumbled like sandcastles against the tide of reality. They called me a prodigy once. Now I was just Dean, the astrophysicist who'd lost his nerve. My fingers traced the cool, smooth surface of my console. The hum of the machinery was a constant. Low thrum, a lullaby for the damned. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful dirge across the frozen wasteland. I'd seen the aurora borealis more times than I could count, shimmering curtains of light that used to steal my breath. Now they were just atmospheric phenomena, another variable to account for. It was late or early, depending on my perspective. The chronometer on my screen glowed a sickly green, indicating a time when the rest of the world was likely asleep. But sleep was a luxury I rarely afforded myself, not when there was the faint, persistent hope that anything might break the suffocating sameness. I was running a routine sweep, the kind I'd done 1,000 times before, deep space beyond the usual chatter of known pulsars and distant galaxies. A silent, empty canvas, or so it was supposed to be. Then the anomaly. It wasn't a blip, not a fleeting fluctuation. This was a signal, a structured, deliberate pattern emerging from the void. My breath hitched. My hands, usually steady, trembled as they hovered over the keyboard. This was different. This felt intentional. My mind, long dormant, began to stir. The old fire, the one I thought had been extinguished, flickered to life. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the readouts, my heart racing a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It was faint, barely above the background noise, but it was undeniably there. A whisper from the abyss. I isolated the frequency, cross-referencing it with every known celestial event. Nothing. It didn't match any natural phenomenon. It wasn't a satellite. It wasn't a stray transmission from Earth. It was coming from a sector of space that, according to all our maps, was utterly devoid of anything. The signal repeated. A complex sequence of pulses, too intricate for random chance. It felt like a key, a lock waiting to be turned. My fingers flew across the keys, pulling up archived data, running simulations. The dust motes seemed to hang suspended in the air, the hum of the machines fading into a dull roar in my ears. I pulled up the deep scan imagery of the sector. A vast expanse of black, punctuated by the pinpricks of distant stars. Absolutely nothing. This wasn't just a scientific curiosity. This felt like an invitation or a warning. I zoomed in on the source coordinates. The image resolved into a dizzying swirl of cosmic dust, so faint it was almost imperceptible. But within that swirl, if I looked hard enough, if I let my eyes adjust to the impossible, there was a shape. A distortion, something that shouldn't be there, something that seemed to absorb the light to warp the very fabric of space around it. My hands fell from the keyboard, my breath catching in my throat. The signal pulsed again, a steady, insistent beat. It was a question, and I had a terrible feeling I was the only one who could answer it. What was out there in that impossible emptiness sending us a message? And what did it want? The thin air of the observatory felt even thinner now, a stale breath I'd been holding for far too long. The anomaly, that's all I could call it. A whisper from the void, a glitch in the cosmic symphony that screamed something was profoundly, impossibly wrong. The usual hum of the telescopes, the soft whir of the tracking motors, had become a monotonous drone, a soundtrack to my growing obsession. I replayed the data stream for the 100th time, my fingers tracing the jagged peaks and valleys of the signal on the monitor. It wasn't random noise. It had structure, a cadence that felt deliberate, and the origin point, that dead patch of sky, the supposed emptiness between galaxies. It was a lie. I leaned back, the worn leather of my chair creaking in protest. My eyes burned, gritty from lack of sleep. Outside, the world was a distant memory. Here in this dome perched on the edge of nowhere, my reality had narrowed to this single, insistent pulse from across unimaginable distances. It wasn't radio waves. It wasn't light. It was something else, something that vibrated on a frequency I hadn't even known existed, a resonance that seemed to bypass my equipment and embed itself directly into my bones. The signal's signature was what truly unnerved me. It was too clean, too pure, like a note struck on an instrument made of starlight, perfectly formed, devoid of the cosmic grit and static that usually accompanied any celestial transmission, and the age. The calculations were absurd, defying every known model of stellar evolution, of universal expansion. It predated everything. Everything I understood, everything I thought I knew about the universe. A sharp rap on the observatory door startled me. My head snapped up, my heart giving a violent lurch. I'd forgotten anyone else was even here. It was the supervisor, the one who ran this remote outpost. He was a man of concrete realities, of practical applications. He dealt with ice cores, atmospheric readings, the mundane physics of a frozen world. He didn't deal with whispers from the void. The door hissed open, admitting a gust of frigid air that smelled of snow and something metallic, like the inside of a freezer. The supervisor stood silhouetted against the weak light of the corridor, his face a mask of polite impatience. Dean, still at it. His voice was a low rumble, accustomed to being heard over the wind. It's late. The ice core readings are due by morning. I pushed away from the console, my legs stiff. I'm almost done, just... Something extraordinary came through. He stepped inside, stamping his feet on the linoleum, his eyes, sharp and blue like glacial ice, scanned the screens, lingering on the alien waveform. Extraordinary, more than the usual stellar flares and distant quasars. This is different, I insisted, my voice raspy. I gestured to the monitor. Look at this, the frequency, the pattern, it's not natural. He squinted, his brow furrowing. He was a man who trusted his instruments, who believed in observable phenomena. This was beyond his charts. Looks like interference to me, Dean. I know how sensitive these receivers can get, especially with the aurora activity picking up. It's not interference, I said, a touch too sharply. I've filtered out everything, solar, terrestrial, even known pulsars, this signal, a region that's supposed to be empty. He crossed his arms, his skepticism a palpable thing in the cold air. Empty space is rarely truly empty, Dean. The way it's propagating, it's as if it's not bound by the same laws. He let out a short, humorless laugh. Now I read talking about ghosts in the machine, Dean. Stick to the data. The ice core samples from the Glacier research camp, ancient ice core reveals impossible age, are more pressing. We have a schedule to keep. He walked over to a workbench, picking up a thick, sealed tube. It was a sample from the deepest strata, the ice a milky, opaque white, hinting at an age that made my head spin. This is real, Dean. Tangible. We can date it, analyze it, we can understand it. This signal of yours is just static. I watched him, a knot of frustration tightening in my gut. He saw what he wanted to see, what he was programmed to see, but I had seen the impossible. It's not static, I said, my voice firm. It's a message, and it's ancient. I turned back to the monitor, the waveform pulsing like a wounded heart. The supervisor sighed, a puff of condensation in the frigid air. I looked at the signal again, at its impossibly pure tones. If it wasn't interference and it wasn't a known celestial body, then what was it? And if it predated everything, then what did that mean for the universe I thought I knew? Had anyone else ever heard this? And if they had, what had happened to them? The air in the lab at the Glacier research camp, ancient ice core reveals impossible age, was perpetually frigid, a constant reminder of the immense, frozen world pressing in on us. Outside, the wind howled a mournful tune, a sound that had become as familiar as my own breathing. Inside, the hum of the servers was a low thrum, a counterpoint to the crackling static that still echoed in my mind. It had been days since I'd first isolated the signal. Days spent hunched over consoles, surrounded by the sterile white of the ice samples, each one a testament to eons of undisturbed silence. My colleague, the lead technician, a man whose face was permanently etched with the strain of perpetual vigilance, had dismissed my findings. He'd attributed the anomaly to atmospheric interference, a solar flare, anything that fit neatly into the established parameters of our work. But I knew better. I had seen the raw data. I had felt the impossible resonance of it. It was a whisper from the void, a language not meant for human ears. I'd managed to secure a small, isolated section of the main processing unit, a clandestine corner where I could work without oversight. The ice core samples themselves were a distraction, their impossible age a puzzle that had drawn me here in the first place. But this signal, this was something else entirely. It wasn't just old, it felt ancient. Older than the ice, older than the stars I studied. I was trying to isolate the carrier wave, to peel back the layers of noise and find the core of the message. The signal was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. No recognizable pattern, no predictable rhythm. It was chaotic, yet there was an underlying structure like a fractured crystal that hinted at a perfect geometric form. The technician's words gnawed at me. "You're chasing ghosts, Dean. The universe is a predictable place. We measure, we calculate, we understand." But what if understanding was a cage? What if the universe held secrets that defied our neat little boxes of physics and logic? The signal felt like a key to a door I hadn't even known existed. I fed the raw data through a new algorithm I'd devised, one that looked for fractal patterns in seemingly random sequences. The screen flickered, lines of code scrolling by at an alarming rate. The temperature in my makeshift workspace seemed to drop even further. My breath plumed in the air. The hum of the servers deepened, a low growl that vibrated through the floor. Then it happened. A section of the waveform, previously a jagged, incomprehensible mess, began to coalesce. It wasn't a translation, not in any way I could articulate. It was more like a revelation, a sudden, blinding flash of insight. The signal wasn't just a message, it was a map. A map of something vast, something impossibly complex. The pattern resolved into a series of interconnected nodes, shimmering points of light against a black expanse. It was a cosmic cartography, but not of stars and galaxies. This was a map of something else, a structure that seemed to exist outside of our three-dimensional reality. I zoomed in on one particular cluster of nodes, a region that pulsed with an unusual intensity. As the magnification increased, a new layer of information emerged. It wasn't static data, it was in motion. The nodes were shifting, rearranging themselves, creating intricate, ever-changing geometries. It was like watching a living organism, vast and unknowable, unfold in real time. A prickle of unease crawled up my spine. This was beyond anything I had ever theorized. This was not a phenomenon to be observed, it felt like an entity. The signal wasn't just information, it was a manifestation. I didn't turn. My gaze was fixed on the screen, on the impossible map unfolding before me. "I think I'm close," I murmured, my voice raspy. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing. "What is that, some kind of visualization glitch?" I finally tore my eyes away, meeting his gaze. "In the middle of nowhere, that's what I've been obsessing over." I shook my head, a slow, deliberate motion. "Not nowhere," I corrected. "It's everywhere and nowhere all at once." As I spoke, a faint, almost imperceptible shift occurred on the screen. A single node, previously dim, flared with an intense, violet light. It felt like a response, like something on the other end had registered my attention. The technician grunted and turned away, muttering about needing to check the primary sensor array. The map continued its silent, intricate dance, but now I felt a distinct shift in its rhythm. It was no longer just a passive revelation. It felt like it was aware of me. My gaze drifted to the ancient ice core samples, their frozen layers holding the secrets of a forgotten world. They felt insignificant now, mere footnotes in the face of this cosmic revelation. The signal hadn't just shown me a place, it had shown me a presence. A presence that was ancient, vast, and utterly alien, and it was looking back. But was it looking at me or through me? The hum of the generators was a low thrum beneath the relentless wind outside. I sat hunched over the console at the Glacier research camp. Ancient ice core reveals impossible age, the screen casting a sickly green glow on my face. That flicker, that violet pulse. It had been hours since it happened, and the image was seared behind my eyelids. It wasn't just a glitch. It couldn't have been. I'd spent the last 2 days running diagnostics, cross-referencing every known astronomical phenomenon, every recorded anomaly. Nothing. The signal was still there, a faint whisper from the void, but the node hadn't responded again. It was like a phantom limb, an ache in the data I couldn't quite place. My colleagues here, the geologists and climatologists, they'd mostly gone about their work, their faces etched with the quiet focus of people accustomed to the biting cold and the immense, indifferent scale of the ice. They'd asked about my equipment, my unusual hours, but I'd waved them off with vague explanations about atmospheric interference. How could I explain that I was listening to something that shouldn't exist, something that might be listening back? The air in the cramped research station felt heavy, thick with the smell of stale coffee and ozone from the sensitive instruments. Outside, the wind howled like a banshee, a constant, mournful sound that seeped into the very structure of the camp. Each gust rattled the prefabricated walls, making the metal groan and shriek. My hands, usually steady when calibrating delicate sensors, trembled as I reached for my mug. I pulled up the spectrographic analysis again. The signal wasn't just a frequency. It was layered, complex, like a symphony played on instruments I'd never heard of, and within it a pattern. A repetition that was too precise for natural cosmic radiation. It was structured, intentional. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the stillness of the night. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the primal instinct of being watched. I spun around, scanning the dimly lit common area. The other researchers were asleep in their bunks, their breathing soft and even. Then a sound, not the wind, not the ice. It was a low, resonant thrumming emanating from everywhere and nowhere. It vibrated through the floor, through the chair I sat on, through my very bones. My breath hitched. The lights in the station flickered, not in their usual erratic way, but in a synchronized pulse, mirroring the rhythm of that unseen vibration. The screens on my console went momentarily blank, then flickered back to life, displaying streams of garbled data, lines of code I didn't recognize scrolling at impossible speeds. My gaze snapped to the main display, the one showing the vast, star-dusted expanse of space. The sector I'd been focusing on, the one where the signal originated, was no longer a patch of black. It was shifting. The stars seemed to warp, their light bending in unnatural ways as if viewed through rippling water. A deep, guttural vibration pulsed through the room, growing in intensity. It filled the audio feed, a cacophony of discordant notes and alien harmonics that scraped at my sanity. I slammed my hands over my ears, but the sound seemed to bypass them, resonating directly in my skull. It pulsed, and with each pulse, the thrumming intensified, the very fabric of the room seeming to stretch and strain. I scrambled back from the console, my chair scraping loudly against the metal floor. My eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, a rational explanation, anything. The geologist's equipment, the seismic sensors and ice-penetrating radar, began to emit a series of high-pitched squeals, their indicator lights flashing erratically. It was as if something was actively interfering, jamming, or worse, communicating with the technology. I stumbled towards the reinforced door, my hand fumbling for the latch. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place, from this thing, as possible. But a morbid curiosity, a scientist's insatiable need to understand, held me captive. That violet light, that impossible signal. It was a doorway to something ancient, something vast, something that was now reaching out. The thrumming reached a crescendo, a deafening wave that seemed to shake the foundations of the earth. The only illumination was the faint, ghostly glow of the equipment's standby lights and the lingering afterimage of that terrifying violet flare. What had I awakened? And was it still out there, or was it already inside? The wind howled, a mournful beast clawing at the corrugated metal of the temporary structure. Outside, the Glacier research camp, ancient ice core reveals impossible age, was a ghost town under a sky the color of bruised plums. I was the only one left, the others having evacuated days ago, spooked by tremors and the unnerving silence that had fallen over the seismic equipment. They called it geological instability. I knew better, that violet pulse. It wasn't a glitch. It was a message. My fingers, stiff with cold and exhaustion, traced the glowing lines on the monitor. The signal was faint, almost imperceptible, buried beneath layers of cosmic background noise. No stars, no nebulae, just emptiness and that pulse. It was too structured, too deliberate to be natural. I leaned back, the worn fabric of the chair groaning in protest. My breath plumed in the frigid air inside the cramped control room. The air itself felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy. It was the same feeling I'd had when I first detected the anomaly, a prickling sensation on my skin, a low thrumming in my bones that wasn't from the generators. I needed more data, but from whom? The scientific community would laugh me out of existence. An astrophysicist babbling about a signal from an empty sector of space, a pulse that felt. Oh, where? They'd pack me off to some quiet retreat, away from my telescopes and my theories. No, this had to be my burden, my discovery. I opened a secure channel, a direct line to a server I maintained off-grid, a relic from a past project. It was a long shot, but I had to try. I began cross-referencing the signal's unique signature against every known catalog of astronomical phenomena, every recorded radio burst, every theoretical waveform. Hours bled into each other. The wind outside became a constant, maddening shriek. The ice beneath the camp groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the floor. Then a hit. It wasn't a direct match, not exactly. It was an echo, a ghost in the machine. A series of obscure, almost forgotten research papers buried deep in archived academic journals, papers that spoke of resonance, of patterns that weren't just mathematical but intentional. They were dismissed as fringe theories, the ramblings of eccentrics. But one name kept reappearing, a Professor Aris Thorne. He'd been ostracized, his career ending in a cloud of ridicule. Thorne had posited that certain cosmic frequencies, when amplified and focused, could interact with, well, he'd used vague terms, subtle energies, the interstitial fabric. He believed these frequencies could be a form of communication, not between beings, but with something vast, something that existed beyond our conventional understanding of space and time. Thorne's work, though dismissed, described the very nature of the signal I was seeing. He'd theorized about its potential source, too. Not a star, not a galaxy, they were nurseries. Nurseries for what? My screen flickered again. This time it wasn't the violet pulse. It was a series of rapid, almost frantic bursts of static, followed by a single, prolonged tone. A tone that felt impossibly deep, impossibly old. It resonated in my teeth. I pulled up Thorne's most controversial paper, the one that had effectively ended his career. He described a specific type of signal, a harbinger. Waking. The tremors started again, more violent this time. The entire structure shuddered. Loose equipment rattled. I gripped the edge of the console, my grip tight. The ice outside screamed. Thorne had also theorized about a way to potentially interact, to amplify the signal to make it louder. He'd outlined a complex series of calculations, a method for focusing ambient energy. It was dangerous. He'd warned of unintended consequences, of attracting unwanted attention. My eyes darted to the main power conduit, then to the array of external sensors. The equipment here, designed to probe the depths of ancient ice, was remarkably robust. It could be repurposed. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating. The wind outside died down, leaving only the groan of the ice and the frantic beat of my own heart. And if I did, what would hear me? The wind wasn't just howling anymore. It was a shriek, a jagged sound that tore at the thin walls of the temporary structure. Each gust hammered the metal, sounding like colossal fists trying to break through. My teeth chattered, not from the cold, which was a constant biting presence, but from a deeper, more primal chill. The lights flickered again, plunging the cramped space into near total darkness for heartbeats that felt like ages. I checked the readings one last time. The anomaly hadn't budged. It pulsed, a slow, rhythmic throb against the background static, like a dying star's final, defiant breath. But this wasn't a star. The data was too clean, too deliberate, and it was getting stronger. I could feel it, a pressure behind my eyes, a subtle vibration in my bones. It was as if the very air in the room had grown heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The others were gone. They'd left me. My hands trembled as I reached for the comms unit, its dead screen a mocking testament to my isolation. No signal, not for days. The storm had conveniently cut us off, a perfect, suffocating blanket. I remembered the assistant's face, pale and drawn as he'd packed his gear, his eyes darting towards the ancient ice core samples displayed in the main lab. He'd muttered something about patterns, about how the ice wasn't just old, it was wrong. He wouldn't elaborate, just shook his head, a silent plea in his gaze. Now I understood. The ice wasn't just a record of time, it was a cage, and something had started to rattle the bars. The temperature gauge on the wall was dropping again, far beyond what any natural fluctuation could explain. It was plummeting, the numbers blurring into a meaningless streak. A thin layer of frost began to bloom on the inside of the viewport, obscuring the bruised plum sky. I looked at the console, at the fluctuating energy readings. They were spiking, not erratically, but in a terrifyingly controlled surge. It was building. I could almost taste it, a metallic tang on my tongue, the scent of ozone and something else, something ancient and putrid like grave dirt disturbed after millennia. My own thoughts felt sluggish, thick. It was harder to concentrate, to hold onto a coherent idea. Images flashed through my mind, fragmented and disturbing. Geometric shapes that defied Euclidean principles, vast, churning gulfs of impossible color, and a profound, crushing loneliness that threatened to swallow me whole. I shook my head, trying to dislodge the intrusive visions. Not just sound waves, but something that seeped into the mind, that reshaped perception. The ice core samples. I had to see them again. They were the key, the physical manifestation of the anomaly's presence, its anchor to this reality. I grabbed my thermal jacket, the worn fabric offering little comfort against the growing unease. The short walk to the main lab felt like an eternity. The camp buildings loomed like skeletal remains against the twilight. The frost had crept in here too, frosting the edges of the large, transparent containment unit where the most significant ice core sample rested. It was impossibly old, a columnar testament to eons. But now it was no longer just ice. A faint, Ethereal luminescence emanated from its depths, a sickly green that pulsed in time with the readings on my handheld scanner. And within the ice, swirling like trapped smoke, were patterns. Not natural formations, but intricate, impossibly complex designs that shifted and reformed, hinting at a geometry that made my head ache. They were the same patterns that had flickered in my mind's eye. This was it. This was the source, or at least the point of contact. The signal wasn't just coming from space. It was being channeled through this ancient ice, this frozen scar on the planet. The thrumming, once a faint vibration, was now a palpable tremor, resonating through the floor, through my very skeleton. It felt like the planet itself was groaning under an immense, unbearable weight. The comms unit in my pocket buzzed, a desperate, futile attempt to connect. I pulled it out, ignoring the dead screen. Then a new sound cut through the wind's lament. A low, resonant hum, originating not from outside, but from the ice core itself. It was a sound that vibrated in my teeth, in my sinuses, a sound that spoke of unimaginable age and an alien, malevolent consciousness. The luminescence flared, momentarily blinding me. When my vision cleared, I saw it. A fissure, impossibly thin, was appearing in the ice, not a crack from pressure, but a deliberate tear widening with agonizing slowness. And from that tear, something began to emerge. It wasn't solid. Not at first. The pressure in my head intensified, threatening to burst. The hum grew louder, more insistent, a siren song of utter annihilation. I had to do something. I had to stop it, but how? How do you fight something that doesn't exist in any tangible form, something that was older than stars? Was there even a how? The metal shrieked. It was no longer just the wind. It was the sound of something else, something vast and unseen. Pressing against the flimsy walls of the Glacier research camp, ancient ice core reveals impossible age. I huddled deeper into my parka, the synthetic fur scratching against my cheek. The air inside the prefab shelter was thin, carrying the perpetual metallic tang of recycled oxygen and the fainter, unsettling scent of something else, something like ozone, but heavier, richer. It clung to everything, a silent, pervasive stain. I had done it. I had pushed the button. The transmission, a frantic burst of calculations and raw data, had screamed out into the void, a desperate, stupid plea for what? Understanding, help, I didn't know. The moment the sequence initiated, a profound silence had fallen over the comms panel, an absence that felt more deafening than any noise. The ancient ice core samples, painstakingly extracted from the heart of this frozen wilderness, had revealed not just millennia, but epochs, ages that predated human comprehension. And within those impossibly old layers, within the frozen breath of primordial storms, I had found the echo, the signal, and I had answered. The panel in front of me was dead, not just a power failure, but a deep, unsettling stillness. The usual faint hum of the life support, the gentle whir of the atmospheric processor, all gone. It was as if the very act of sending that signal had drained the life from the camp. Outside, the wind had shifted. The shriek was gone, replaced by a low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the ice itself. It was a sound that spoke of immense pressure, of forces far beyond anything I had ever modeled. I tried to stand, my legs stiff and unresponsive. The floor felt wrong beneath my boots, not solid ice, but something yielding, subtly shifting. I looked down. The thin layer of frost that usually coated the floor was moving, not melting, but rippling, as if something was stirring beneath. This wasn't a storm. This was something else. My gaze drifted to the viewport, a thick, reinforced pane designed to withstand the brutal Antarctic elements. It was frosted over, obscuring the outside world, but I could see vague shapes pressing against it. Not snowdrifts, but bulges, organic and impossibly large. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was more horrifying than any sudden lunge. I remembered the data, the impossibly structured patterns within the ice, the energy signatures that defied every known physical law. It wasn't just an anomaly, it was a signature, a calling card, and I, Dean, in my hubris, had responded. I had opened a door. A faint, rhythmic thudding began, distant at first, then growing louder, closer. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the ice. It was a pulse. Deep, resonant, and it felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. The entire structure vibrated with each impact. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the sound bypassed them, resonating directly in my bones. My eyes darted to the emergency beacon. It was still there, a small red button on a panel I had meticulously avoided touching since my arrival. It was designed to send a distress signal, a final, desperate cry for help, but to whom? And what could they possibly do against this? The thudding intensified. The rippling on the floor grew more pronounced. It smelled acrid, like burnt copper, and something I couldn't place, something ancient and wrong. It pooled on the floor, reflecting the dim emergency lights with a disturbing, oily sheen. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The shapes at the viewport distorted, elongating, pressing harder. The metal of the shelter groaned, a sound of imminent collapse. It couldn't process the impossible reality unfolding around me. What had I unleashed? Was this the entity the signal had hinted at? Was it here on this desolate ice shelf, responding to my foolish transmission? I had sought knowledge. I had sought answers to the universe's greatest mysteries. But the universe, it seemed, had its own secrets, and they were not meant for mortal minds to grasp. The thudding stopped. A heavy, suffocating silence descended, broken only by the frantic, ragged sound of my own breathing. The rippling on the floor ceased. The pressure at the viewport seemed to recede. For a moment, a fragile, terrifying hope flickered. Had it gone? Had my signal been enough or too much? Then a single, impossibly slow crack echoed from directly above. It wasn't the sound of ice breaking. It was the sound of something tearing, a vast, rending sound that seemed to stretch into eternity. What was that sound? The metal shrieked. The tremor that ran through the floorboards was deep, a resonant thrum that vibrated in my teeth. It wasn't the ice shifting. It was awake. I'd spent months chasing ghosts in the static, a phantom signal from a void where nothing should be. Now the void was knocking. It lay on the makeshift table, a cylinder of frozen time, its layers a testament to epochs I could barely grasp. But within those layers, something else had been preserved, something that pulsed with a faint, sickly luminescence when I shone my headlamp on it. Not organic, not mineral, something else. The shriek intensified, a sound that clawed at the edges of my sanity. It was like the grinding of celestial bodies, the tearing of reality's fabric. My breath hitched. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to abandon the camp, the data, everything, and flee into the blinding white expanse. But my feet were rooted, my gaze fixed on the glowing core. The signal. It wasn't just a broadcast, it was a call, and what was calling had finally found its way home. The entity, or whatever word I could conjure for the colossal, indifferent force that had etched its presence into the very bedrock of this frozen world, was no longer content with its silent vigil. It wanted what it had left behind. It wanted me. A crack spiderwebbed across the reinforced window of the mess tent. Then another. The metal walls groaned, not with the strain of wind, but with an immense, unseen pressure. I could feel it on my skin, a prickling sensation like a million tiny needles. The air grew thick, heavy with an odor I couldn't place: ozone, decay, and something achingly, profoundly old. I remembered the calculations, the impossible data points that had led me here. It was a pocket, a scar in the cosmic tapestry where something had been deposited. And now it was being reclaimed. The ancient ice core was not just a record, it was an anchor. And I, in my foolish pursuit of knowledge, had disturbed its slumber. A low hum began to emanate from the ice core itself, a counterpoint to the ear-splitting shriek outside. The luminescence within the cylinder flared, casting an ethereal, greenish glow that illuminated my trembling hands. I saw patterns within the light, swirling geometries that shifted and reformed with sickening fluidity. They were not of this universe. The pressure outside became unbearable. The floor buckled. The shrieking reached a crescendo, a sound that felt like it was peeling back the layers of my skull. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. I opened my eyes. The lights were out. The shrieking had stopped. The pressure had vanished. I stood in the inky blackness, my heart racing a desperate rhythm against my ribs. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the frantic beat of my pulse. Slowly, cautiously, I reached for my headlamp. The mess tent was a ruin. Twisted metal lay strewn about. The windows were shattered, but the walls, miraculously, still stood, and the ice core, it was still there on the table, its faint glow a solitary beacon in the wreckage, but something had changed. The patterns within the luminescence were still, no longer shifting. They were static, frozen, like a finished sentence. The wind had died, the snow had stopped. The world was unnervingly still. The signal was gone. The entity, whatever it was, had been satisfied. It had taken what it came for, or perhaps it had simply moved on. The ancient ice core had served its purpose, acting as a lure, a beacon, a key, and I had been the unwitting locksmith. I looked back at the damaged camp, the silent, imposing expanse of ice stretching to the horizon. I was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. The knowledge I had gained was a poison, a secret I would carry to my grave. The universe was not empty. It was teeming with entities beyond our comprehension, ancient and vast, with purposes utterly alien to our own. I turned my back on the camp, on the glowing ice core, and began to walk. The stars watched, silent and eternal. The silence was not empty. It was waiting, and I had heard its voice. Had I truly escaped, or had I merely been released?